All right, let me know if you can hear me. All right. Awesome. All right, we're just going to give people about another minute or two, and then we will kick this off. Thanks, everybody, for joining. Looks like we got a good crowd tonight. Now, if you're joining from an iPad or an iPhone, occasionally there's audio issues with those. So just a heads up. I don't know why, just something that happens with the software. But hey, JB, Bolton, hello. Dana, hello. Anthony, hello. Lauren, hi. All right. So let's get rolling on this. It shouldn't be too long. I don't think so. Maybe 35, 40 minutes. I'll leave some time for questions at the end. So again, thanks for joining the webinar tonight. My name is Noel Bonk. I'm the founder and coach of Bonkworks Endurance Sports. So a little bit about my company, Bonkworks. Now we offer personalized coaching programs for cyclists and triathletes of all abilities. We also provide performance testing, metabolic testing, camps, clinics, consultation. We do some nutritional consultation, basically whatever you need to fit your endurance sports training needs, okay? So if you're interested in learning more about our services, you're welcome to set up a time to chat with me or with Coach Matt and learn a little bit more. So a little bit on some housekeeping here tonight. So the chat window is open. I have it running on a separate computer, but during the presentation, I really won't be able to see what's going on in the chat. So I'll ask you to kind of hold your questions to the end if possible, okay? Now, if technically everything goes well, there will be a recording of the presentation that should be available. Usually it's 2 or 3 hours afterwards that you'll get a link and to it so that you can watch it at your leisure if there's something that you missed. But feel free, again, to reach out if I don't answer all your questions tonight, okay? Also, if you're on social media, and I don't blame you if you're not, but if you are, and you can give us some social media love on Facebook and Instagram, you can keep up on what we're doing as far as events and camps and clinics and all that stuff I just mentioned, as well as future webinars. Not sure the next webinar, possibly late next month or the following. I think we're going to do one on using bike power for planning Ironman distance bike splits. So that'll be a good one to check out. So, all right. So tonight's webinar, we're going to get into a little bit of the physiology and the processes of how FTP and AT, or anaerobic threshold, is created. All right. So while I'll try to keep the science generally light and not go down too many rabbit holes, we're certainly going to cover some of the science behind it. Okay. And I think that's important for people to understand, because if you understand how this is created, how FTP and anaerobic threshold is created, then you'll know how to test it, and then you'll know how to train it. Okay. All right. So let's move ahead. All right. So we're going to start off with a little bit of introduction to energy systems, okay? And we're going to talk about ATP, so adenosine triphosphate. So this is a unit of currency used in cellular energy, right? What a topic to start right off with, okay? But what I want you to understand is this is the currency that makes your engine go, okay? And there are 3 primary ways that ATP is created, but each source is different, and they're different in how quickly they produce ATP, and they're different in the amount of ATP that is created, right? So there are 2 anaerobic sources, and there's 1 aerobic source. So the first one here being aerobic, or what we call oxidative, right? This is a long-term energy source, okay? It requires oxygen, it's aerobic, right? It uses fatty acids and some carbohydrates, and this has the advantage of supplying a lot of ATP, so a lot of energy, but it takes longer to produce it. All right. So the second one, anaerobic, or what we refer to as anaerobic glycolysis, is a short-term energy source. So this uses carbohydrates, right, in the form of blood glucose and muscle and liver glycogen. And just like the one prior, it produces a lot of ATP, but it takes still some time to produce it. And that supply is limited. And it also has a disadvantage, which is creating our friend, which is called lactic acid. All right. Now, the third one, ATP-CP, is immediate source. This is creatine phosphate. This is typically what is stored already in your body. So again, it's a very limited supply, maybe 10 seconds or so of energy. This is an energy source that you would use for like a track sprint, weightlifting. Again, it's a very intermediate but a limited supply of energy. Now, as I mentioned, these processes or sources used to create energy are aerobic and anaerobic, but I wanted to kind of expand upon this and bring mitochondria into the picture, right? So this is important as we'll talk about why people have different lactate thresholds, okay? So aerobic, as I just mentioned, it means with oxygen generally, okay? But if we deep dive into that a little bit more, what we're really talking about is a rate. And this is a rate that's slow enough that that ATP, that energy, can be generated via mitochondrial oxidation. And key off again that word oxidation. Again, we're using oxygen. And then second, anaerobic, as I mentioned before, is without oxygen, right? So what that really means here again is this is a rate that exceeds what can be generated in the mitochondria, right? So we're exceeding that. And since it exceeds that, guess what? We need to supply that via anaerobic means, okay? But ultimately, and typically, the difference between a pro and amateur endurance athlete is that the pro has much more ATP being generated via mitochondria, okay? All right, so ultimately, when we talk about energy and mitochondria, the next step is really to include a brief look at muscle fibers, okay? And I promise you, we won't get too sciencey on all this stuff here. We'll keep moving along, and you'll see how all this ties in. But you have three types of these fibers, and guess what? Some perform better aerobically, while others anaerobically. So we have this type 1, so people have heard of slow twitch, okay? Slow twitch is actually what I'm referring to as a contractive force, so how it contracts. This is oxidative. Again, it's using, it's anaerobic, or it's aerobic, pardon me. And also this relates to high levels of endurance, or the ability to contract the muscle for long periods of time without fatiguing. So if this was a car engine, this would be a high mile per gallon type of engine, like a Prius, right? Can go for long periods of time. And these muscle fiber types, these type 1s, are generally pretty abundant in endurance athletes, okay? Very common. Now, the next type, type 2A, is what we call fast oxidative, right? So these are generally considered an in-between of the type 1 and this type 2X, all right? Meaning that they can mimic both the type 1 and the type 2X, or what we refer to as that they're plastic, okay? So they can produce ATP or energy via both oxidative and glycolytic metabolism. So now if you start thinking a little bit about training, you'll start understanding a little bit about how we're going to use these muscle fibers in our training. Now, finally, type 2X, or also known as type 2B, which is our fast glycolytic muscle fiber, right? So these have the highest contraction force, very limited endurance, but high power. So if we're comparing these against the Prius, this is our dragster engine, right? This is the power, right? These are generally more abundant in our sprint or our power athletes than the type 1s. Now, if we think about body composition and we think about athletes, that we can envision different athletes out there. So we think about runners, for example, we can picture a sprinter on the track or a marathon runner and the different types of body types, or a grand, a GC contender in a grand Tour de France compared to the sprinter, right? Very different types of muscles, very different types of abilities, okay? But those abilities to somewhat are trainable. So why is all this physiology? Why is this so important? Okay, because as the saying goes, cycling is an aerobic sport, right? So the type of muscle fibers and the training you do will directly affect your fitness, meaning that if you're an Ironman athlete, it may not be time well spent working on building a 1600 watt sprint. All right, there may be some uses for doing some neuromuscular power, but that's not time well spent. And if you're a BMX rider doing 4 or 5 hour zone 2 rides, probably not time well spent. So again, things to think about. So one other thing to keep in mind when we're talking about energy systems and we're talking about all this physiology is that these energy systems do not work in a silo. Okay, and I'm sorry, maybe this chart may be a little bit blurry when I blew it up. But what I mean by that is that this energy mixture changes, okay, based on the intensity and duration of the activity. So in this chart, and this chart is based on running, right, we can see that for very short efforts, like a 100-meter type of run, we're using a lot of creatine phosphate, right? We're using that readily available energy source to get that sprint done. Not so much of the other energy sources. But if we slide all the way down to the right for the marathon runner, well, guess what? It's almost completely aerobic, right? So we're using primarily those other energy sources for that effort. And then of course, stuff in the middle is using a little bit different mixture. But keep in mind, you're always using some of all of them. It's just the mixture changes based on what you're doing. We're not robots. We don't operate in a silo when it comes to energy. All right, so now let's talk about the importance and the role of lactate. So I'm not talking about lactic acid here, as that has a role, but lactate as a fuel that's produced when the body breaks down carbohydrates. So the harder you work, the more carbs you're going to use and the more lactate you're going to produce, okay? And so lactate is not a waste product. Some people think of lactate as a waste product, and I think they're confusing lactic acid, but lactate is not a waste product. It's a fuel that the body uses, okay? But the ability to uptake that lactate in the mitochondria has an effect on performance. So as I mentioned before, the differences between a pro and amateur athlete of how they process and use this energy, again, this is where lactate starts to come into the picture. But I know some people may be interested in understanding, and I'll touch briefly on lactic acid. So, where does that lactic acid burn come from? It's not the same thing. As I mentioned, the body uses lactate, not lactic acid, for fuel. But during that process of converting glucose into lactate, hydrogen is produced as a byproduct, okay? So what hydrogen does is it lowers the pH of our blood. And so when we get a lower pH, it's acidic, right? And that causes the burning. So this is, again, that burning is not what causes the muscle soreness, right? The muscle soreness typically is from a little bit of micro trauma and stuff when you exercise and you build and work in, the muscles. But, lactic acid is really believed to be a protection system for the body. So it's the body saying, hey, I'm working hard, and it's throwing up the flag there a little bit. And that's the lactic acid to tell you what's going on. All right. So now that we know something about how and when, energy comes from and how it's comprised a little bit in the body, let's move on to kind of better define what FTP, functional threshold power, and anaerobic threshold is, okay? So while they're not actually the same thing, if you go and ask an exercise scientist, you're going to see through the definitions here that they really are closely interrelated, okay? So FTP, what is FTP? And this is the definition that I like, and there's several other definitions out there on the internet, but I like to refer to it as the highest power a rider can maintain in a quasi-steady state without fatiguing. And you're going to notice there's an asterisk after fatiguing. So technically, yes, it's without fatiguing, but you're like, oh, I can't go forever at my FTP. So no, you can't go forever at your FTP. Typically, it is around 60 minutes for the FTP. Some riders will be under, and guess what? Some riders can be over that 60 minutes, okay? What I really want you to focus on with a definition of FTP is that it's functional, that we can use it, and the fact that it is a steady state, right? And so steady state means that it's kind of this balanced equation. Now, anaerobic threshold, right? We start talking about that. This is the intensity, and this is expressed as either in speed or power, wattage or watts per kilogram in body weight, at which the lactate production rate equals the lactate combustion rate. So we're producing it and we're burning it. And again, it's equal, right? Therefore, this is the highest intensity at which a steady state of lactate can be sustained. And so we also refer to this as a maximum lactate steady state, okay? So again, this is another steady state condition like FTP, right? Starts to kind of connect. So, and this is a steady state between non-fatigue and fatigue. And so in testing and research, we now know that, and we've seen that trained and well-trained cyclists can actually use FTP and FTP tests. And we'll talk about FTP tests further on in the presentation, but they can use it as a non-invasive and an alternative to estimating maximal lactate steady state, which is typically done obviously via like a blood draw to the finger or earlobe. All right, so let's expand a little bit on those definitions, and let's kind of start looking under the hood of what's going on here. So we have this energy balance. We have FTP in the middle, and to the left of the FTP, we have things that are happening under that FTP, under threshold. And to the right of FTP, we have things that are kind of happening, that are happening above threshold. So below threshold, all these things are starting to stabilize. Blood lactate stabilizing, that pH is stabilizing, we're not having that lactic acid burn. The oxygen uptake stabilizes. The body's able to meet that demand for the oxygen that you're taking in. Creatine phosphate levels are stabilized, and you're using fatty acids, okay? Now, on the other side, okay, we're starting to increase that. So now we can't really go continuously. We're going above threshold. So what's happening? Well, blood lactate is rising, so we're producing more lactate, okay? The pH may decrease, meaning that since the pH, again, is decreasing, as I mentioned before, the blood's becoming more acidic. Oxygen uptake is increasing to meet that demand. Creatine phosphate levels are decreasing, and those fatty acids are being pushed out of the metabolism. So we're having to meet those demands through other energy sources. I also think it's kind of handy to look at this as a conveyor belt. And again, as we start thinking again, that steady state type of system. So, as lactate is being produced here, right, it's being processed by the aerobic system. And this is much like what's happening when we're riding or exercising under threshold. The aerobic system is able to very effectively handle that load or handle that demand. But now let's say we've started to increase that load. We've increased that demand. We're riding harder. We're doing a hard sprint. We're doing a hard effort, right? So we're really increasing that load. So the system is now producing more lactate than can be combusted, that can be burned. And those boxes are just stacking up like crazy, okay? And we know that that's not a sustainable state, right? We're fatiguing. We're quickly fatiguing. But what happens when we balance this? The lactate being produced now that's coming in is being combusted or burned at the same rate. That's a steady state, right? And then we apply a power number to that state. And again, this is what we're going to start to refer to as FTP, functional threshold power, or anaerobic threshold. And here's another way to look at it. As the speed and effort, or speed and power here, increase, we also continue to increase the lactate production, okay? We're needing to burn that lactate. The body meets that lactate combustion until we reach this crossover point. That crossover point, anaerobic threshold, or FTP. So once we go past that crossover, that production has exceeded the combustion, and we begin to accumulate lactate faster than we can clear it, right? So we're going above threshold. It's getting tougher. The efforts are getting tougher. Legs are starting to burn, right? So we fatigue quicker. But under that, so if we start to look at the areas under that, well, guess what? Those areas are more aerobic, right? And we're burning it now faster. We're burning the lactate. We're combusting that lactate faster than we produce it. Means, again, that we fatigue slower, okay? All right, so ultimately, what determines your FTP and your AT, right? So the biggest thing is first of all, is going to be muscle fibers that I talked about. That's why I brought muscle fibers, okay? Based on your body composition, right? So, and that's tied in with your genetics. Some people are genetically going to have a predisposition to one type or another type, okay? But here's the other thing, training, of course, right? This is what, we're talking a little bit about tonight is training. We can train these systems, but training has to be targeted properly. So without knowing the full picture here of how this is created, we're kind of training a little bit in the dark, okay? So this means you really need to first figure out what your FTP is, have a method for doing that, maybe what your strengths and weaknesses are, and then you need to understand your event demand. So event demands is, and I'll use two polarized opposites here, which is Ironman compared to like a BMX race. So an Ironman bike split, or like maybe a century ride or a long stage race, a very aerobic, or a BMX is very short, very, very anaerobic. Okay, what do I need to change? Okay, what do I need to train? The other thing here that determines it is your size of your engine. And of course, this ties in with the muscle fibers and genetics, okay? But I want to use this to introduce a term that some of you may not be familiar with, which is called VLA max, okay? Which, as VO2 max, as some of you may be familiar with, is your maximum aerobic capacity. VLA max is your maximum glycolytic capacity. So remember, we talked about that balance between the production of lactate and the production of lactate and the combustion of lactate, so how fast we're producing and how fast we're burning it. VLA max gives us a way to measure now that process. So why does this VLA max matter? Why do I bring it up in this presentation? Because it's the other half of this energy equation. And it's the size of that engine and the size of that engine that determines how fast you produce lactate, and it's also totally trainable, okay? So a high VLA max means that your lactate production is high, right? So you have a high VLA max, you're producing a lot of lactate. A high VLA max means that you use more carbohydrates, right? So especially for long rides, this becomes important as we start thinking about how you're fueling. A high VLA max means you use less fat. So again, depending on if it's a very long ride, and you don't want to, you can only take in so many carbohydrates an hour and you only have so much stored in your body, well, that could become an issue, right? But conversely, a low VLA max means you use less carbohydrates. It means you burn more fat, okay? But a high VLA max is not necessarily a bad thing. It just depends on the event. If I was Andre Greipel, a sprinter, who's a Grand Tour rider, I want to have a decent VLA max because I want to be able to put out power. I'm not so worried about, climbing the mountains or winning the overall. But if I'm Chris Froome or I'm a Grand Tour contender or I'm an Ironman contender like Jan Frodeno, I want to have a pretty low VLA max. Now, VO2 max is probably at the end of the day more important than what your FTP is, okay? Because VO2 max, a lot of people talk about this is really, your ceiling, okay? But what VO2 max is, of course, it's your maximum oxygen uptake, okay? And this is typically measured in milliliters per minute per kilogram per body mass. But really what this is meaning is this is the amount of oxygen that stays in or that you can utilize in your body for aerobic metabolism, okay? This is not your lung capacity, but what you can utilize, okay? A higher VO2 max means you have more mitochondria. Here we come back to the mitochondria, right? And can process more lactate. So a high-level athletes really have a better ability to uptake that lactate in the mitochondria because that mitochondria is well developed, right? They have a very big VO2 max. They've done the work. Maybe they have the genetic potential to the muscle fiber types, right? But they have a high density, they have a lot of mitochondria to be able to process that lactate instead of putting it back out in the blood, and so it doesn't accumulate. But here's the thing, even if you have a relatively low VO2 max, it's trainable. it can be trained, right? So let's look a little bit more here about the mixture of two different athletes, and we'll expand a little bit on this, on why this VO2 max and the VLA max, how they're both part of the equation, right? So two athletes both have the same FTP, 300 watts. Rider 1, 300 watts. Rider 2, 300 watts. Both the same weight, 160 pounds. But when we start to look at how their FTP is comprised, they're both created totally different, right? So Rider 1 has a VO2 max of 50 milliliters per minute per kilograms, right? So, okay, that's super high. It's kind of average for like just a everyday type of athlete. And the VLA max, though, is pretty low, 0.3 millimoles per liter, right? So pretty low. And then Rider 2, VO2 max, pretty decent, 63 milliliters per minute to kilograms. And to give you some reference there, Tour de France riders, 80. There's a guy who's got 90. So, this guy is not winning the Tour de France, but he's got a decent VO2 max compared to weekend warriors. So his VLA max, though, kind of high, 0.9 millimoles per liter per second. So how these guys are going to train and what they're going to go after to raise their FTP, completely different. So Rider 1, he needs to raise his VO2 max. He needs to concentrate and focus on raising that. So his training has to be focused around that. Rider 2 needs to do training to lower the VLA max down. So the other big thing to look at here between the two differences in these riders is fueling. Fueling is going to be completely different for these two riders. Consider that Rider 2 produces more lactate, right? Because their VLA max is higher. That means that if they're doing a long ride or they're doing an Ironman, for example, they're going to have vastly different fueling requirements. One is going to burn through carbohydrates a lot faster at that power than the other one is. So what does that mean? How does this mixture, again, really affect our FTP? So again, a rider who uptakes lactate faster means that you're using up that lactate, combusting it faster, will have a higher FTP, right? Raising your FTP means you can ride harder, stay aerobic longer, and recover faster. That's sort of the no-brainer, right? But the less lactate produced means there's less that needs to be combusted. So, which also means you have a higher FTP. So if we think of that chart I had, about 4 or 5 slides ago that had the crossover to red and the blue lines, this really means that we're pulling that out a little bit taller, a little bit further out. That's what we're after. And this is also an interesting way to look at the difference between what separates, you from Jan Frodeno, Sagan, Froome, all these top athletes that are out here. And of course, we're looking at VO2 max and we're looking at VLA max. So we know, okay, VO2 max certainly is going to be higher, 80 compared to maybe 60, 62 here. But look at the difference in VLA max between a professional and amateur. And even a professional sprinter like somebody like Andre Greipel is still going to have a much lower VLA max than probably the weekend warrior. Not always the case, but still, but compared to Greipel, compared to Froome, yeah, that he's going to be higher than he is. So, but big differences here between the professional and amateur. So something to consider. Doesn't mean, you can't change some of that, but some of that also, of course, is genetically gifted to these athletes. All right, so now we kind of understand a little bit about the physiology and the mixture that goes into creating FTP. Let's touch base a little bit here on some of the different testing methods and a little bit maybe with some of the pros and cons and how some of these work. So 60-minute time trial is a great way to test, or we call it our 40K, which is usually, most people aim for being around 60 minutes, are a great way to look at. You look at the power over a 60-minute effort. What did you do? That tends to be pretty close to your FTP number, right? If we go back to that definition where I talked about, it's right around 60 minutes. Well, there you go. That's a good way to test what you're at. The problem with the 60-minute time trial is how often do you want to go out and do that? You want to do that every 8 weeks? That's a pretty hard effort. So certainly if you're doing a 40K TT, you're going to get it in, but not a lot of people want to go out and replicate that effort on a regular basis, it's pretty brutal, and it's a lot to recover from. So that's where we kind of get into the 20-minute test, which is really a short time trial. So there's a couple different variations of the 20-minute test. We always go with the one that was developed by Hunter Allen and Andrew Coggin, which has that 5-minute blowout and then does the 20-minute test. And the idea of having that 5-minute blowout is to use up some of that anaerobic system, right? So then the 20-minute becomes mostly or almost purely an aerobic effort. And the other reason we do this, as I've talked about, that some people, based on their genetics and how their FTP is created, if you just go and do a flat out 20-minute time trial and you're much more of an anaerobic animal, you're going to do a big part of that anaerobically. So having that 5-minute really is designed to take that out. And then, of course, you're going to take 95% of that. And there's a lot of research, especially of late, that's come out to say that that's a pretty valid test. The other great thing, if I can say there's a great thing about doing any FTP test, is that it's pretty reproducible, right? You can do a 20-minute test. It's hard. Certainly, it's hard. It's not necessarily enjoyable. I think there's some people that enjoy it out there, but you can do this without it really destroying you for a long period of time. You can get it done, and it's over with, and you get the data, and you can do it indoors. You can do it outdoors, right? So another way to do that and to get their FTP is race efforts of approximately an hour. So you race a crit, you race cyclocross, you do some other event, it's right around an hour, and you're going to look at your normalized power. And so the reason we look at normalized via average power is that normalized gives us the true cost of the effort. So if we think of a criterium and we're coming out of, it's a 4-corner criterium, and every corner we're coming out of that 1,000 watts, and then we're doing a 0 watts, and we're doing 1,000 watts, right? It's very peaky, very bursty type of effort. So we want to look at the true cost of that versus maybe a hilly stage race or something else that could be around an hour, or even a cyclocross. Even the efforts in cyclocross are going to be different. They're not as peaky as a criterium. They're certainly high, and then you come back down around threshold, and then you go again. But that's why we want to look at the normalized, the true cost of that effort. So you can use that as a benchmark. You can also use, if you have a lot of data that's collected, you have tools like WKO5 and Training Peaks, you can look back through lots of hard efforts and hard rides and hard training sessions and get a good idea of what your FTP is. So if you do a little bit of data digging, you can get that too. So also want to mention, lab testing. So lab testing is another great way to find out that information. But of course, lab testing is not always convenient. But I want to touch a little bit more on the lab testing, of course. So really a couple different ways to do the lab testing. Some of them may have heard of the gas analysis. This is where you're wearing a mask on your face and you're breathing, and usually it's some sort of test or ramp test that you're going up an effort every so often. And it's measuring those expired gases to really determine your VO2 max and those ventilatory thresholds. Okay. Then we have lactate tests, where we're just, we're doing it, we're drawing blood from the finger or the ear, and in some cases actually even the toes. This is of course usually done as some sort of step test, and we're looking for like an inflection point when that blood lactate really starts to come up, right? And then finally, we have these, what we call full metabolic tests. And these can be combinations where they have lactate testing in it and maybe gas analysis in it. But these are really ones that are looking at the entire body, what's going on. It's looking at VO2 max, it's looking at VLA max, it's looking at fat and carbohydrate combustion. It's looking at stuff like how your intervals are designed. So a little bit more encompassing. We here at Bachworks, we use an inside platform, and I'll mention one slide on the inside platform that really is a full metabolic test to see what our athletes are doing. And then we also use things like the 20-minute tests. We use workout data, race data, all these type of things to see, where our athletes are, how they're performing. Is their FTP coming up? Does it need to come down? Are we accurate with the data that in the zones that we're setting? So here's a little bit of a comparison, and I know this is maybe a chart with a lot of lines and text on it, so it's maybe a little buggy on the eyeballs, but I'll go through it kind of quickly here. So, and pick out a couple of different points on here. So first of all, like if we're looking at the accuracy of threshold, like in determining that threshold. Lactate test 5 to 10%, FTP test 5 to 20%, metabolic profile tests like Inside tend to be more accurate, usually around 2%, give or take, depending on how well the data is collected, and that's true for anything. Okay, some can determine VO2 max, some can't. Some can determine, VLA max. Obviously, a full metabolic test can. Some can determine fat and carbohydrate combustion. And of course, that's important if we want to understand if we want to train using fat, or we want to understand how to fuel and how we're burning through carbohydrates. Of course, lactate accumulation, interval and recovery times. How often, how fast are we accumulating lactate, and how long and at what effort do we need to go to remove the lactate or use up that lactate that we just produced. Okay, very powerful stuff for some of the metabolic platforms. Okay, projections, meaning that where I am now, I trained for 12 weeks. What am I going to look at? What am I going to look at with a different body composition? What am I going to look at if my VO2 max goes from 50 to 63, or my VLA max goes from 0.9 to 0.3? So again, but accessibility is also something where these really differentiate. So lactate tests typically are done in like a university lab. So not really accessible. It varies. Some coaches know how to do them. FTP test, of course, extremely accessible, right? I could be doing an FTP test as soon as I get off this webinar. It's very easy for people to do the FTP test to get access to it, right? Metabolic profile tests, of course, varies. They're becoming more, you're seeing more and more of them out there. Platforms like Inside are kind of taking what's happening in the laboratory and handing it off to coaches a little bit, which is, again, making them a little bit more accessible than they probably would have been in the past. And so just a little bit more on the Inside platform before we move on to how often we should test. So metabolic profile. So the Inside test really, the good thing about the Inside is it really gives us accurate details on both sides of that engine. So again, we're not going around with a blindfold over our eyes trying to understand, what's the size of those engines, how big is the VLA max, how big is my VO2 max. Of course, carbon and combustion and production rates. How fast are we burning those? What are we doing with those? And then fueling, very important, right? So if we're burning through a lot of carbohydrates, we need to know that, because that could be something that's surprising. You run out of energy on a long ride because you didn't know how to fuel properly, or you didn't know you were burning through a lot of carbohydrates. Getting that information is really gold. Of course, setting training zones, that certainly you get that from FTP, but you get that through metabolic profiling as well. And then the other thing that's kind of really neat is interval design, which is understanding, and I kind of mentioned that in the slide before, is knowing like, okay, I produce lactate at this rate. So if I'm producing lactate at 0.5 millimoles at 300 watts per minute, and I go several minutes at that effort, I've produced X amount of lactate. Now to get rid of it, I know I have to ride at this level. Okay, now I have to ride 150 watts to get rid of that, and it'll take me 5 minutes to get rid of it. So this is the kind of neat stuff that you get from, things that we do in platforms like the Inside. All right. So let's move on from that. So let's talk about a little bit, how often should we test? So this comes up a lot. I see athletes sometimes that come to us for testing that haven't tested in a year or more, and they're still using the zones. They did an FTP test a year ago, and they've been using those same zones, and that just drives me nuts because these things change. And FTP is not a hard target in the first place, okay? It floats a little bit around, so usually I have kind of a range. But optimally times to do this are at the beginning of training season. So if you're just starting a training season now, most people started a while ago, but let's say you're starting it right now, good time to test. Get the test in, get some numbers, understand, at least get in a ballpark of where you need to be, okay? Also, another good time to test is after large training blocks. So let's say you've come through 12 weeks of some base training and you're starting a build phase. That's a good time to maybe, am I on target? Have I come up? Have I stayed the same? And even after some of those build phases, did I get out of that training what I was supposed to get out of that training, okay? And then another time to do it is to kind of qualify what you've done. Like you've gone out and you did a criterium, or you did a cyclocross race, you did some hard ride with your buddies and you're on Training Peaks and it says your FTP went up, or you did a ride on Zwift and people are famous for posting those Zwift by FTP increase. It went up. Well, test. Make sure it actually matches what you had there. You didn't have some data spike or some fluke. That's a good time to do it. So when those training results and race results show that you increase, and these aren't the only times, but typically as an athlete, if you're training throughout the year, you should be testing this probably 3, maybe 4 times. There's no hard and fast rule to this, but use your best judgment. Talk to your coaches about it. If they're not testing, ask them to test, do the test on your own. Most of us, the people that are on the call, are endurance athletes. You're racing, you're doing Ironman, you're doing cyclocross, you're doing all sorts of things. You can make it through a 20-minute test. So you can get through. There's not a lot of excuses to not do that type of test. Or better yet, come do a metabolic test with us. All right. So uses of FTP. So why is FTP kind of important? How do we use FTP in training and racing? Okay. So first and foremost, FTP gives us a way to set zones, right? So we can set zones. So in this case, we use Training Peaks for our athletes, and we can set FTP in there as a training zone. People can set FTP as a training zone on their Garmin and Zwift, all these other platforms, but allows us to set these training zones. So we know basically, where's active recovery, where's our endurance or zone 2, what's our VO2 max. And again, you could use classic power zones. These are the Coggin classic power zones. You can use eye levels. There's a few different variations depending on who you subscribe to for your training for power zones, okay? But FTP also gives us a performance benchmark, right? So knowing that, and I mentioned that Zwift, and people like to post those Zwifts, like my FTP went up a watt or it went up 20 watts or whatever. It's a good way to say, is my training working? It's also a good way to say, am I recovered? Because hopefully you did that test when you recovered a little bit, and say, am I going in the right direction with my training, or did I go down 30 watts? And what's the reason for that? Okay. The other great thing about FTP and power in general is it allows heart rate and perceived exertion to really make sense. So heart rate can be affected, and I'm not anti-heart rate, but heart rate can be affected by lots of different stuff. If you don't have a power meter and that's all you have and all you can afford is to do RPE and heart rate, that's fine. But you don't know if heart rate's been affected by you drank a bunch of coffee. Am I dehydrated? Am I tired? Why is that heart rate high? And so power, a watt's a watt. So, it really helps make sense of that data when you have it and you've collected over time. Okay. And we can look at decoupling as well. Like, is a heart rate decoupling? Is it changing over time for long rides? That's a great way of using FTP versus, the data in your heart rate. Another great thing about FTP in training is it really helps us develop race and pacing strategies. And I'll use Ironman again as an example. So for our athletes who do Ironman, we use FTP and we do a lot of modeling of the data, and we use some other software tools, and we have to make sure that FTP is accurate. So, because we want them to race the bike portion of Ironman, as I call it, like Goldilocks. We don't want it to be too easy. We don't want it to be too hard because they got to run afterwards. So we want that pacing strategy to be just right. And so having the proper FTP, testing the FTP allows us to develop that pacing strategy. And again, even if it's for other ultra long endurance stage racing, understanding FTP, where it is, how it's changing, how it's made, what you can do, what your strengths and weaknesses are, will help you develop that race strategy and pacing strategy. So how do we raise FTP, right? That's what we're all after. We want this FTP to come up. We want to be super strong. We want to rip off our buddies' legs. But here's the thing, raising FTP is highly individualized, okay? So if you're new to training, or you're in what I mean by new to training, you're within maybe the first 3 years of structured training. You can do, there's pretty much consistency and rest is going to raise your FTP to some end, right? It's going to increase it, but you still have to train in the right zones. And generally, most of us are going to see, results spending time just below threshold, just below FTP, and then spending time just above it. Okay. So that's usually going to be the most effective time. So let's think about a little bit the different zones that we train in and how these each can either help or how they all can they can help FTP one way or the other. So zone 2, long, slow distance training. So zone 2 sometimes gets a bad rap. And I think that's because most people don't either do enough of it to make it work or don't understand what it's all about. So zone 2 is still the most effective way to build mitochondria. And so if we understand mitochondria, as I mentioned before, and understand having more mitochondria and having more density of mitochondria allows us to, use up that lactate more effectively, well, then it starts to make sense that zone 2 has to be part of the equation, okay? Zone 2 is also relatively low impact on the body, okay? But the downside of zone 2 is you got to do enough of it to make it work. Going out and doing an hour of zone 2, if you've been training for a while, probably is not going to build a lot of mitochondria, right? So you probably got to be in the 3-4 plus hour ranges. If we think about how pros train, right, they're doing the easy stuff very easy to doing the hard stuff very hard on those days. And so the easy stuff, like the zone 2 stuff, they're doing a ton of it. Now, probably everybody on the call here is probably a weekend warrior. So you maybe don't have 20 hours a week to train, but you can still benefit if you have time to do the long, slow distance rides, of course, at the right zone and at the right duration to make it work. But this is where sweet spot kind of comes into the equation. And so this is kind of the zone 3, the tempo type of work. And sweet spot is 88 to 92% of your FTP. So just under. So again, this is spending time just below. So it's intensive, but it's intensive enough to elicit a training response. So you raise that FTP, but it's not so hard. It's harder in zone 2, but it's still not so hard that you can't repeat some of that sweet spot training, a couple of times during the week, or you can't incorporate some sweet spot even into your group ride. You could do a little, you can pull a little bit the front, get in that zone. And when it gets too hard, then you sit in, right? So you can stay into that. Okay. So now we're talking about really lifting that FTP up from the bottom. I know Hunter Allen, and if some of you are familiar with Hunter Allen, who wrote the book on training and racing with a power meter, talks about FTP being like a table. And so sweet spot is a way to kind of put your hands underneath and lift up that table. So that's what we're doing. We're lifting up that to make the table come up. So now if we think about threshold, of course, that's zone 4. It is good to get some time, in and around right at the threshold. Sometimes there's a little bit less benefit of training at the threshold, but you want to be able to ride at that. You want to make sure the body is prepared. Is that zone proper for you? What does that feel like? But now let's go to the other side of that table, using that same analogy. Now we're trying to lift that table up from the top, right? So this is going to be the VO2 max type of stuff, the max aerobic, right? This is us raising that ceiling, making that, picking that table up. And as I mentioned before, if we can increase the size of that aerobic engine, if we can bring up that VO2 max number, the better we can deal with lactate. But here's the thing, FTP, and this is one of the last slides, is not the full picture to any race success. So we do put a lot of emphasis on FTP and AT, and of course this presentation was about that, but I don't want you to think that's all that it's about that's out there in training, and I should just be focused on that number. Absolutely not. It certainly has it's certainly important, but it's not all about FTP. Of course it helps. Typically we see in races somebody with a higher FTP. If my FTP is 300 and I'm racing against Coach Matt and his FTP is 375, and everything else is kind of the same, he's got probably a better shot of beating me because of that. But there's other things that come into the equation that we have to think about. Efficiency, how are we turning our energy, moving forward? Race tactics. Now, if we think of that slide where I had rider 1 and rider 2, same FTP, it's a short race. One guy's sitting in the wind, burning energy the whole time. The other guy's sitting in. All right. There's some differences there, right? And of course, in fueling, am I fueling? And then ultimately, what's happening under threshold? We really got to understand what's happening aerobically. And I put that in as the last bullet point to go back to the fact that when I talked about cycling, it's an aerobic sport. And so those who know who, Dr. Coggin is, he says it's an aerobic sport, damn it. And so we'll leave it at that. All right, so I'm going to move into the question phase. I'll put up some sources here for a minute, and I'll scroll back through. Give me a moment and see if there's any questions. Okay, we see Matt talking about his FTP, but if you have questions, and I know it was a lot of information, but go ahead and type them in the chat box. I'll give a couple of minutes here. Doing pretty good on time. I'll also mention, like, as far as, well, people are thinking up some questions here, you know, as far as like training, what's some common ways to train, like sweet spot, for example. So one of the most common ways you hear people talk about is doing sweet spot 2x20s. Okay. And we've seen 2x20s until you know, forever, but you can be creative with the 2x20s. You can break them up. You can change the rest intervals. Okay. I'm going to do 4x10s with 1 minute rest intervals or 2 minute rest intervals. You know, typically we see 2x20s being done by athletes at the CAT, you know, 5, 4, and 3 level. You add a little bit more sweet spot in there as it increases up as well. So Emily. So Emily's asking about the ramp test. Do I feel if the ramp test is a good test? You tested a 20-minute test and found it was much lower by 47 watts. Yeah, so there has been some research to show that the ramp tests can be accurate, but I tend to believe that the longer the test, the more accurate it becomes. And this sometimes can be the problem with the ramp test and even the 20-minute test is that motivation plays some key in it. So, you know, you had a 47 watt, that's quite a difference. So what I would probably do in that case is I would actually have you do a longer test. So as much as you probably wouldn't like that, maybe I'd probably have you do a 30-minute test, and then I would look at that data. But that's a big difference, and we'd have to also look at to say where were you pulling the data from? You know, was your power meter was it zeroed out? Or was there something wonky going on between, you know, if you're on a smart trainer or a power meter that may have been affecting that big of a difference? So we'd have to deep dive. But typically, again, not to go on and on about that question, if I have an athlete that I kind of want to test in between, a ramp test is something that I may throw at them because it is so quickly done. All right. Other questions? Pretty quiet out there. We have a few more minutes on the questions. Oh, great question, Matt. So how does somebody get an inside test if they are interested? Okay, so you can reach out to me. I'll have my contact information on next slide here. I'll bring that up while I'm talking here. So send me a message if you're, you know, I typically will have people, you know, we'll drive a couple hours even to come in for the inside test. It takes about 90 minutes. You can sign up for the test on the Bonkworks website, or you can email me and I can give you the information on that. So yeah, so Justin, that's a great point. So, you know, the automatic detection. So there's lots of different software out there. I see this on the Run Power stuff as well. You know, that it may detect an FTP increase. Training Peaks does it as well. That we get this. So the best thing, as I mentioned before, if we're seeing that data and it's saying that racer training data is saying my FTP, test. You know, does it match? And doing a long test, if you want to suffer through a 60-minute test, that's awesome. Read that power weight ratio is better for determining where your rate is. I'm not sure what you mean by rate, Jack. But certainly power to weight ratio is going to make a difference, right? If you have the same FTP, like we use an example where they are both the same weight, but if I am 40 pounds lighter or 40 pounds heavier, is that going to make up, yeah, how you're going to compete against all the riders? So yeah, certainly, you know, but there's a diminishing return depending on the type of event that you're going to do. There's been some research showing that Ironman athletes, you know, don't need to be super lightweight and super lean. You know, they're not climbing, Mount Ventoux. So they don't need to be super. It's better to be maybe more durable in that case. There's also some with what we call lactate distribution space as well, where leaner athletes are able to dilute lactate a little bit better than athletes who aren't quite as lean or have as much muscle mass. Yeah, so Matt pointed out, like, unless you're in a velodrome or something like that, where aerodynamics becomes more of an issue. And again, like in a criterium race, weight's not going to matter quite as much in a criterium unless it's got hills and stuff in it, because it usually tends to be flat. Aerodynamics is going to be quite an issue. As I said, FTP is not everything, but a hilly race, and Jack, I know you do some hilly road races, so certainly watts per kilogram is part of the equation. But I have also seen athletes who have lost so much weight where they're starting to lose muscle and their performance tends to go down. So that is a balancing act with that too. Yeah, so Brian, great question. And yes, so I have done about 16 of the inside tests since we've brought that on. And then I've done a number of the ones where we're looking at the predictions as well too. So probably another dozen of those. And this is the thing I'm kind of going to sort of humble brag a little bit, but the athletes that are Bonkworks and that we've coached, there has been an extreme correlation between what we believe their FTP to be and what inside his test telling us it is. And that's great because, we look at several different software models and all that test data to make sure that it's accurate. So again, we're looking at the FTP test. I'm looking at modeled FTP that I get from WKO5. And so typically what I see is when we do the inside test, and it tends to be a 4-phase test that we're doing four different efforts depending on what data we get from the very first test. But if somebody comes in and they tell me that their FTP is 270 watts and we do the first test and I see that their lactate, their VLA max, their lactate is like 11 millimoles, then I know that that's way above. Or at the same time, they come in and they say it's 275 and they do the test and I'm seeing it's only like 2.5 millimoles. So, and I'm looking for around 4 millimoles for that to say that's pretty close to what your lactate, your threshold, your lactate threshold is going to be when you do that test. So my athletes, when they come in, yes. Unfortunately, some athletes that I know that come in that either not coach, maybe work with somebody else coach, or most of these people haven't tested often. Going back to what I said before, that's, I see people who've not tested in a long period of time, they tend to be 20, 30, 40 watts off and they need to reset those zones. And for some people, it's a little bit of an ego check, right? But we need to put that aside when we start thinking about the FTP. Who cares how big your number is? It's more important to make sure you're working where you need to work. Let's see. Some more pizza. Yes, pizza. That's carbohydrates. There you go. All right, so that's an interesting question, JB, about the cadence. So there's some different thoughts about cadence and what's a more effective cadence. What I always learn is that a low cadence is mechanically more efficient, but a high cadence is metabolically more efficient, okay? There is definitely training that we do with our athletes in what we call high torque, which is low cadence work. And the idea of having low cadence, especially like in sweet spot type of work, is the muscle fiber recruitment. So we wanted to have those muscle fibers start to mimic the other muscle fibers. Doing that low cadence is a good way to try to do some of that recruitment. However, if we think genetically what you're predisposed to, everybody's kind of predisposed to some degree to the cadence, right? Some people are definitely going to be a little bit more into big gear mashers and some find it a little bit easier. Average 101, yeah, that's fairly, that's not crazy high. But, it could be interesting, again, to, retest and see about keeping the cadence down. But between that test that you just did and another test, I would do some different cadence training. I would do some high cadence, maybe some, 2x10s or 3x10s of some high cadence stuff. And then I would do some sweet spot work at some low cadence, some 20 minutes at real low cadence, as long as you don't have any problems with your knees. This could be 55, 60 RPM type of work, and see how your body feels. Me, I like the low cadence stuff. I feel like my heart rate is much lower. I can do the low cadence stuff all day long, but I can do high cadence as well too. Will your FTP testing be different indoors and outdoors? So yes, it will be, okay? Is it beneficial to do one or the other? Yes, it is. So what I typically do is like this time of year, if we're in beautiful central New York, upstate New York, you know, what it looked like outside today, there was a little bit of snow, right? So we're probably not doing a lot of riding outside on a regular basis. We're probably indoors in the pain cave on Zwift. So I want you to train indoors. I want to get an FTP number indoors. Going outside, yeah, your FTP numbers certainly can be different. It can be different between bikes. It can be different between trainers. It can be different between power meters. So if you're training indoors on one bike and then you switch over to another bike, here's the thing. It's probably not a bad idea to get a number on that bike, right? Your position's a little bit different. I definitely see different FTP numbers between triathlon bikes and road bikes, right? Just based on the different muscle recruitment over a 20-minute effort. Awesome questions. So Tim brought up a question about people really getting too much about like the technical devices and especially for younger athletes or just focus on the numbers. So, you know, I definitely think, you know, like the joke of it, if it's not on Strava, it didn't happen. That's definitely kind of starting to get a little bit, you know, kind of, you know, out of control a little bit with the numbers. I do think the numbers are important for younger athletes, less so depending on the age. You know, training them on RPE is a great way. I mean, you could have them have the numbers, but maybe not show them the numbers. But they need to get in tune with the body. One thing I like to do is have my athletes do ride on field type of rides, or ride on, you know, or swim on field, run on field, and that's to kind of hit a couple of different things. One, it's to get the body in tune with how the effort feels. How does that effort feel? You know, if you're staring at that power meter, you're staring at that Garmin all day, you know, you can disconnect from how that feels. But I don't want you to do that. I want you to get in tune with that. So that's really important, okay? The other thing is that there's some research to say that the body is a very complex system. Obviously, going through just some of the science here, you get an idea. It's very complex, and training properly is very complex. And so sometimes we need to mix it up a little bit. And so having days where we're either not looking at power meters, stick it in the back pocket, or we're doing those right on field days, and you feel good, go out and hammer it. You feel like crud, take it easy. You know, but some of those days we're shocking the body out of that structure. And again, structure is certainly important, but we don't need to do it all the time. So here's the real two secrets of training, as I tell everybody. Consistency is number one, right? You got to be consistent, and then rest. Sleep is the number one performance enhancing drug that's out there. So make sure you're hitting those two, and then you're going to make sure you're hitting the right structured plan and zones is the third. Yeah, sometimes, you know, that happens with people, you know, Anita, with veteran athletes. You know, if it's a case where you're training and they want you to do what they got to do, sometimes you got to ride by yourself to build that fitness. You know, I do find that there's some athletes. I had a friend of mine that I coached for a number of years, and I did some kind of pseudo-scientific type of testing with him to see whether or not his RPE fit with the power numbers, and he was right on. But he's a guy who raced for 35 years. So there's something sometimes to be said about the veterans, but you got to make sure you're doing what's right for you. And the FTP builder on Zwift. So I'll try not to soapbox too much, Anthony, on the plans that are in Zwift. And there's a few workouts that are on Zwift that I wrote a number of years ago when they came out. The problem with some of the plans on Zwift is there's no real logic to how they're created. Like if you've never trained before and you do the FTP builder, maybe you're getting a response because you've never done structured training before. But at the same time, again, if you Google around, there's a couple of coaches that are out there. One from Carmichael Training System who really went on a rant about how poorly built most of the Zwift plans are. Again, I'm not saying everybody needs to go and sign up for a coach, and coaching is right for everybody. Certainly it's not. Certainly we would love to coach everybody on here. and there's lots of good prepackaged plans out there. I tend to think most of the ones on Zwift personally are garbage. So if you're struggling with a low cadence effort, okay, what can you do to build that? You're gonna have to just kind of work on it. Like start a little bit, maybe a little bit. So if the low cadence is 65, start at 70. So you can't hit the 65, start at 70. Okay, maybe you need to adjust the power a little bit. Or maybe it's something else, but you need to give your body time to adapt to those efforts. Okay, it could be some strength training. Are you weak off the bike as well? Do you need to do a little bit of strength training to support that? Great questions. All right, we're going a little bit over, so I'll give another about 30 seconds here if there's any other questions. Again, you are welcome to email me if you have any questions. If you're interested in finding out more about the inside testing, and we usually do that on Saturdays and Sundays now over in got a location in Clay, New York that we can do those. If you're interested in coaching, I have personally one slot open for coaching. Coach Matt has a couple of slots open. We typically start to fill up this time of year with athletes, but if you're interested, we're not a high pressure sales crew here. Everybody who comes on is our family. We love to talk to you. Obviously, we do this stuff because we're passionate about it. We're passionate about the sports. We're not pro athletes. We're everyday weekend warriors, just like everybody on the call here. All right. And so with that, we're going to end this. I appreciate everybody coming on here. Great questions, great turnout tonight. Thank you very much.